Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. I'm your host, Matt Tuman, and tonight we're going to be talking about how you can create your own sketchbook using the New York Central watercolor paper. But before we get into any of that, I'm going to have to explain to you guys all the different materials that you use for bookbinding because there's a lot of different stuff here. If you want to see any of it, if you want to check it out on our website, go to JerrysArtarama.com and type in our class code for tonight, which is going to be JL297 into the search bar. It's going to come up with our teacher's cart where we have all the supplies that I'm using tonight, so you'll be able to find it and find it easily, essentially. But we got to get right into explaining all the supplies because bookbinding is very time consuming, and I kind of had to come up with a few little shortcuts to be able to get all the information that we need to in this episode tonight. So first off, we're going to talk about glue. You're going to need a lot of glue for this. Whenever you're looking for a glue for bookbinding, PVA glue is what you're looking for. This is also on right here, it's called a neutral pH adhesive. This is a type of PVA glue from Lineco. If you get PVA, it stands for polyvinyl acetate, and essentially this is the kind of glue that you want for bookbinding because it's super strong, it's archival, and it is flexible, which is it's gonna become really important. Excuse me guys, I was really quiet all day and now I'm talking a lot. It's just hard speaking after you've been silent for so long, so just let me warm up a little bit. But PVA glue is really helpful when you're gluing the spine of a book because their spine needs to be flexible and move with it, which is why this glue is really helpful. And I also recommend if you're looking for PVA glue, try not to get a tube of it because they do come in tube with caps. Lots of times they're not waterproof when they come in those tubes. This is a waterproof PVA glue, and that's really helpful because I've used those tubes before for bookbinding, and they're really frustrating because if your cap gets any glue on it, they get stuck on. It's impossible to open, and you have to cut open the tube, which is really frustrating. But this bottle right here, the important thing about this glue being waterproof is that if you get any of this glue caught up in your cap, you can dunk this in a bucket of water, and it washes the glue away, and you won't have a blockage in your glue bottle. So we got PVA glue, we got binder clips, lots of binder clips for holding your paper together, keeping them all centered and even. I got a really large ruler, I got an X-Acto knife. If we come into the overhead here, I can start showing you guys all these little doodads that we have. This right here is known as a bone folder. It is not made out of bone, though they originally would. This one's just made out of plastic. If you don't have a bone folder, I've used the edge of scissors before, but when you're folding paper, this is super, super helpful. It's not, sometimes you think you can kind of get away without it, but trust me, this is gonna save your hands. And then these right here are awls, A-W-L. They're gonna help make the holes in our binding and our paper for when we're sewing everything, because there's going to be a lot of sewing in this episode. I'm going to try my best to teach you guys, if none of you have any sewing experience, how you can do that, because it can be a little bit frustrating at first. But yeah, we got sewing thread here, needles, we got beeswax, because we're going to have to wax our thread, which I'll get to. And then I also have a glue brush, which is just any kind of brush that, it's feathery, so it's going to get the glue into all the little nooks and crannies, but you're not going to worry much if this gets ruined or anything. And then water. Because since this glue is water soluble, when you get it on this brush, you're going to want to dunk it straight into your water. So that's all my materials here. Also got a cutting mat, which is super, super important. The table's a little different color. But I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to show you guys. We're going to do Coptic binding. There are lots of different types of bookbinding, and I've been bookbinding since I was a little kid, so I actually brought a lot of different examples of my own sketchbooks. This top one right here is what we're going to be doing tonight. This is Coptic binding. So you can see here, this spine is actually unglued. I didn't put any glue on this. That's kind of optional when you're doing Coptic binding. And we have our cover here is attached directly to our pages, as opposed to creating a text block like you see here, and then attaching the covers on it afterwards. So that's kind of the difference between Coptic binding and other types of binding. The other really great benefit for Coptic binding when you're making a sketchbook is that it's able to lay flat. And I have a lot of other examples here of different types of bindings you can do if you guys are curious about other types. But for now, and let me know in the chats too if you guys have tried bookbinding before and what type you have tried, because there's such a large variety of bookbinding that you can get wildly different results for wildly different purposes. But before we really get into anything, well, here. Let me pull this out because this is important. Paper. The New York Central watercolor paper is what we're going to use for this. It's going to be a great watercolor sketchbook, really. And some of you might be wondering too, if you just jumped on here just because you like watching Jerry's Live, you might be thinking, why would I even want to try bookbinding when I can just grab a book from the store? And one reason might be is that you want like your favorite watercolor paper in a sketchbook and they don't sell them in sketchbooks yet, which, you know, or you're just picky, because watercolorists ironically are known for being picky. So if you're picky about your paper and you want a specific size sketchbook or specific binding, this is how you can get it. This is our New York Central watercolor paper. It's a really good one, and it comes in this handy little bag with the Ziploc on it, so I don't have to worry about cutting this out of a block. But I wanted to pull, this is our hot press. The binding that I'm going to be working on with later is cold press, but the results are going to be the same. I wanted to pull some loose sheets out so I can show you guys something that's very important when you're thinking about bookbinding, which is paper grain, which is not something you're always thinking about and can be very frustrating at first, because when I did a lot of these sketchbooks that I have down here, when I first started out, I wouldn't think about paper grain at all, and I would just be folding the paper whichever way was most convenient for me to get the size I wanted. That's not always going to be helpful if you want your sketchbooks to last for a long time, because you can see here, when you have an industrial made paper, this isn't the case for handmade paper. They don't really have as clear of a grain. But when you have industrial made paper like this, the grains of your paper are going to be moving in a specific direction, and that's going to affect how well your paper can fold in a specific direction. So how you test for grain is doing what I just did right there, just slowly bending it, and whichever way has the least resistance is going to be the way you're going to want to fold your paper. So that can be kind of frustrating. I know when I started out with this, I actually had a smaller sheet of paper that I was working with, but the way I had to fold it to be able to go along the grain would have made a really skinny book, so I had to size up a little bit. But you want to keep your paper like in the path of least resistance there, because if you go the other way, your fold is going to be fighting against the grain, and it can cause your paper to tear and wear down faster over time. So especially since we're working with thicker paper here, and thicker paper can be a little bit harder to bind, following the paper grain is really important. And if you're working with really large paper, it might be helpful to cut your paper down to a smaller size to be able to feel that grain a little bit better, because when you're working with really large sheets, it can be kind of hard. So I made my sketchbook here. The sizing that I decided I wanted was just one of these 11 by 14 sheets folded in half, just to make it easier for myself. I could have cut this down to whatever shape I wanted. Shape and size, really. You can do a lot of fun shapes with bookbinding, but we're not going to get into that because that gets really complicated very quickly. But all you got to do, you can mark a line in the center of your paper if you like, but one really easy way to fold your paper without having to do that, since you're going to have to fold a lot of sheets, is just fold it in on itself and make sure your ends are lined up right there. And then you're going to take your bone folder, hold it down, and just press in. And I normally run it over a couple of times, and then you got your folded piece of paper. When you have your paper folded like this, I used to do this as a kid a lot. I don't know if this is just a me thing, but I used to like do that to like make it easier to fold back and forth. Don't do that. That also will weaken the structure of your paper and cause it to tear like more often, especially when you're sewing here, because when you're sewing, this fold can get really weak, especially when you're using really thin paper. So try and only fold it once and then keep it like that so that it stays nice and strong for when you punch your holes in. Okay, so I got my paper here. I'm gonna show you guys real quick how you can, I got all my stuff around here that I'm like grabbing the wrong thing. If we have any questions, now is gonna be a good time because I gotta do a little bit of rearranging real fast. Yes?
I do. On YouTube, Ralph would like to know, how do you know the grain of the paper before you buy it?
You can't really. If you can get your hands on a sheet like these, I don't really recommend taking the paper out of the packaging before you buy it, because you don't really want to grub up people's paper if you don't end up buying it. But like for sketchbooks and stuff, you can do that little test at the store. If you're getting a handmade paper, you don't really have to worry about it. So if you really don't want to have to worry about paper grain before you buy it, that's something you can do. But if you're really worried about it, I would suggest sizing up and getting larger paper, because you're more likely to be able to get the size you want. Because, you know, if this paper was slightly smaller, or it was like, if it was cut like this instead of like that, I would have to fold it and it would be like super thin like that, which would not be great for book binding, but that's actually what happened here with this super thin book. I didn't want it to be this thin, but I ended up doing that because that's the way the paper grain was going, and I only had sheets of paper that were that big. So I kind of worked with what I had. But you can't really tell at the store unless you're going around doing this to all the sheets of paper. So I know that's not the best answer out there, but it's kind of, you can't tell just by looking at it, unfortunately. Most sheets of paper, it's not really clear just by staring at it what the grain looks like. So unfortunately, that is the case. But I'm gonna show you guys, before we get into how we can start sewing and everything, I'm gonna show you guys how to put together your cover. So I have already put together one part of this cover on this side, and this was some paper that I just marbled yesterday. If you want to know about marbling, we did Mikey Tries. There's a video on Mikey Tries that I sent them the link for this so they couldn't put it in the chat, where he tries paper marbling. But if you want a show on it, let me know. We could try a show on it later. I'm not going to get too much into that now, but I just wanted to have a pretty cover for you guys. So I have that cover already done, but I'm going to show you guys how I do the other half of it real quick. And this right here is very important because you can tell that I just grabbed this off of a sketchbook that we had emptied out, because that's normally what I do when I don't want to erase paper. But the thing is about this is that this is not book board, this is chipboard. And typically if you want a super high quality archival book, you're going to want to use book board, because book board is always going to be archival quality. Chipboard, on the other hand, which is commonly used to package papers, is not always archival. And it could have like some acidic properties to it. I actually pH tested this, which is kind of funny, just to see if it was archival or not, because they don't always list it on the packaging if it is. And this actually had a pH right around 7. And if you guys know, anything with a pH of 7 or above is considered acid-free or archival. So this was on the lower end of that, and it's okay. I do it just because I don't like want to waste these, like this chipboard when it comes off my sketchbooks, and I feel like it's helpful anyway. If I go through one of those pad sketchbooks, I can use this for another sketchbook, you know. So that's what I want to use here tonight, just so I can show you guys how you can be a little more handy with some of your waste. But just keep that in mind, that if you want something that's going to last a super long time, this does have a little bit of acid in it that's going to wear down the archivability of your sketchbook faster than traditional book board would. So I wanted to show you guys how you can cut this, because whenever you're working with cardboard or thicker material, it's really easy to cut yourself. And I have an X-Acto blade right here. Cutting mat, make sure your cutting mat is down, or anything that you don't mind cutting into. I got my ruler down here and I've marked my line out where I want this to be. And all I'm gonna do is actually here. I'm actually gonna cut this off first so I don't have to just run my blade over it a million times. I'm gonna put my ruler, I'm gonna put my ruler down. And I'm gonna very carefully just skim my blade over top of it. I'm not gonna apply a ton of force. This is the thing that I really wanted to show you guys, because lots of time if people aren't used to cutting cardboard like this, they kind of want to jam into it and get it all at once. But you really don't want to do that, because that's gonna like increase your risk of cutting your fingers. You want to make sure your fingers also like not right there. You know, keep your hand on the ruler, keep it steady, and just carefully with like a medium amount of pressure, you know, go over that line over and over again until you kind of feel this part snap off. It's gonna feel like you've cut through the entire thing before you actually have, and it's kind of a feel thing. See, that just popped off of there? There you go. It felt like I was already hitting the mat prior to that, but it wasn't fully cleaved off yet. And if you stop before that and shift this around at all, you can kind of get a jagged edge. So I got that piece off. I'm gonna cut this piece real quick. I had to do hours of this when I was in college, because we used to just make stuff out of cardboard a lot, because I went to a design school and that's what you do in design school. But it's long hours of cutting cardboard, surprisingly. See, that's not quite off yet, but it feels like it is.
Matt, are you cutting those to the exact size of the folded paper?
I am, actually, which you don't always want to do with other types of binding. For Coptic binding, you can kind of get away with it. And I'm gonna make sure I cap this and put it away so I don't stab myself with it. But you can see here, it's like it's perfectly cut to size. I can see my paper peeking out a little bit there, but I also haven't quite finished my binding yet. But it looks like good. I don't have to worry too much of if I have other types of binding, like this type of binding down here was a more medieval type of binding actually. I don't know the exact name of it, but I just know it's more from the medieval ages, and I had to make sure that my cover was just a little bit over the lip of that paper to protect it. But the Coptic binding is more of a sandwich, so you can cut it right to the same exact lengths of your paper and it doesn't matter as much. But if you want to go over a little bit, it's not a big deal. Just keep in mind that this edge of your book here, the way that we're binding this, it's going to be flush with your paper. So if you add a little bit of space to every single side of this board, this side is going to pop off a little bit more than you expect it to. So that's something to keep in mind if you do want to make your cover just a little bit wider, but you don't need to. Okay, I got this board down, and I have this other piece of paper that I marbled yesterday, and I'm gonna try to cut it down to size. Well, here, yeah, I'm gonna cut it down to size. I was debating if I wanted to glue this on to the paper before cutting it down, but it's probably just easier if I cut it down right now. All I do for this is I take my ruler and I just cut straight down onto this. You don't have to measure exactly, but you don't want this part's gonna wrap around the inside of your book. You don't want it to be super thin, otherwise you're gonna struggle a lot. So I give it about 1 inch, and I believe this ruler is about 1 inch in width. I always try to put this on the back of it, but no X-Acto knife does that, I think. But it's just an instinct after using markers for so long. This paper is super thin, so it just pops right off. I think I might leave the edges, those edges as is, and just cut down these sides some. Now, this is the important part when you're cutting this paper. Let me know too if I keep leaning into the camera. I'm trying to get like a good, what is it called? Leverage on this blade while I'm cutting, so I'm unconsciously keep tipping forward. But this is the important part right here when you cut your corners, because what we're gonna do is essentially create flaps that fold over the side of this. You wanna make sure when you're creating those flaps that you're not gonna cut right up to this corner right here. You wanna give it just the tiniest bit of room. And I'm gonna show you why in a second. But if I just take my ruler and kind of tilt it right there, just beyond it, I'll pull off that triangle. And I cut mine, some people will cut them kind of in a V shape. I cut mine just straight across. It doesn't really matter, whichever is your preference. Because I'm gonna end up covering the inside of this with another sheet of paper. So if I get like the tiniest bit of gap there, it's not the biggest deal. But I'm just making sure that I cut this properly. Turn this around, don't shift it too much. There's a lot of cutting and a lot of math in bookbinding, so be warned. I should be using the ruler the correct way. Also, if you're doing bookbinding, highly recommend that you get a ruler with a cork on the bottom, because it gives just a little bit of traction, and it's gonna make it a lot easier to not cut yourself when you're doing this kind of cutting. If you got one without a cork on the bottom, things might be a little slippery, so be warned. Okay. You can see now I have the tiniest bit of room beyond those corners, and then I'll be able to just kind of fold these up like that, but I'm gonna glue the back of this on first. So I got my PVA glue. And I always end up using a bit more of this than I think I would. And it's actually really helpful here, really quickly. I'm gonna get some scrap paper to put under this so I can get all the edges. And this paper right here, I'm using the same scrap paper that I used to marble this, which is just the Soho marker paper that I have right here. Soho. So I'm just gonna put a sheet of this underneath this real quick so that I can make sure I get all of my edges without getting glue on my mat. You can see that glue, it feels like a lot of glue that I put down, but like it got smeared out really quickly. So I might have to put a little bit more on in a second, but really make sure that you get all of your edges, you get all the way to the edge, because if you're trying to paint around them carefully, you might have problems with it not sticking properly. And I'm gonna put a little more of this on. always be cautious. Like, start out with less glue that you probably think it should need, even though I said, like, this absorbs the glue really quickly. Because if you over glue things, you're gonna risk bubbling on your paper, which is never fun and not very easy to fix, if straight impossible sometimes. So to keep you from starting over, always start out with a little less and then add a bit more as you go. I'm gonna make sure I get this edge up here. Yes.
Could you seal your cardboard or chipboard to make it last longer in terms of archivability?
You could. You could put what is known as a buffer outside of it. I have not done that personally. I could not. I can't remember. I think calcium carbonate is commonly used as a buffer. How you would apply that to the outside of this, I'm not sure. You could do that. Just keep in mind that any kind of acidic material with a buffer on the outside of it is still never going to be as archival as a purely acid-free material. So if you want to go that far to put a buffer on the outside of your material to be able to keep it archival, you might just want to go out and buy bookboard. And why do I have this knife just sitting out here? See, this is what happens. You lose track of them so quickly. I got...
You just switched directions so fast.
See this, okay, I have 3 needles here. I have 2 awls, I have a sharp blade, and I gotta keep track of them because this is how you get stabbed when you're bookbinding. And this is already drying a little bit too because I've been a bad habit of talking with my hands and not working. This is why I took Italian in college. Figured I'd fit in. Okay, that's probably pretty good. So I'm gonna remove my scrap paper really fast. Move these out of the way. Okay, and then I'm gonna be very careful to try and center this without covering my fingers in glue. Okay. So I'm gonna stick that down and then really quickly, this is very important right here, flip it around and take your bone folder and smooth it out. I'm using a thinner paper for this right now. This is going to be important whether you're using fabric, paper, or anything else for your cover, is you're going to want to smooth it out to make sure there's no bubbles in it. I actually forgot to do this step when I originally made this book. And I managed to recover it because it was still a little damp, but I got little bits of like folded down bubbles down here when I realized I forgot and tried to like smooth them out. So there's just little folds in it now. So make sure you do this no matter what material you're using for your cover. And keep in mind too, I'm using paper for this right now, but you can use fabric. Don't do this with fabric though, if you do. You can see this, you need a book specific fabric if you want to use fabric for it, or you need to get a type of film that goes on the other side of whatever fabric you use to make it into a book fabric. It's kind of like a papery film that you iron onto it that's able to absorb glue properly. I did not do that with this, which is why all the glue kind of seeped through in this book. I didn't mind it because it's just a little scrap sketchbook anyway, but make sure if you use fabric that you're using proper bookbinding fabric if you don't want that effect. So I got that all smoothed out. Now I'm gonna get my edges. Putting my glue down here. Oh shoot. Need to get my scrap paper back out. I can't tell you how many times as a kid that I just glued my cutting mat. It's a little bit of a bumpy cutting mat now. It's just got chunks of glue on it from when I did stuff like this and didn't use a scrap piece of paper.
Could you use a roller, like a brayer or something, instead of a bone folder?
You know, maybe. You probably could. I don't see why not. I'm sure you could. I think the only thing is that it might be a little more difficult to manage than a bone folder because a bone folder is just super easy to fold and use. Hold, not fold. I'm so caught up in folding that I forgot I was trying to say holding. In any case, but I definitely think you could. I don't see why not. Ooh, almost got that crunched up. Okay, one last side here. I'm trying to work quickly too because you can see my paper is warping a little bit since this is a water-based glue, but it'll smooth out as soon as it dries. If I get that last side, and I make sure I put my brush in water so that it doesn't dry sticky. As long as it's sitting in water, it should be fine. But you're gonna take your edges and very carefully make sure they kind of hit the very edge of your bookboard there, or whatever you're using, chipboard. And fold it over. And then I'm gonna take my bone folder again and just pull that down. Make sure it's nice and flush. And you can see here, this is the area where I cut just a little bit beyond the board. Actually, if we can get the dynamic on this really quickly. Okay, right here I cut just a little bit beyond the board. I'm just gonna take that corner and I'm gonna flatten it down with my nail just like that, so that that corner gets covered when I start to fold this one over. See how that kind of creates that really neat corner there? If we can go back to the overhead, I can show you guys. This again was one of those books where I did fabric and I didn't do that with the corners, so you could see the fabric is fraying and kind of exposing the bookboard. So to get a clean finish, you want to keep that little bit of overhang there. I'm gonna keep trying to pull this over. Keep in mind too that I'm showing you guys how to do this kind of condensed into an hour. Bookbinding can take a very long time. It can take you a whole day. It can take you multiple days when you consider drying time and things like that. I've worked out several different steps here that I have pre-made for you guys so I can just pull them out. But if you're impatient, this is gonna be a tricky one for you. You can see my glue's drying there already. So I'm just gonna put the tiniest bit back down. That's probably gonna seep out, I put too much. But that's okay, because I'm gonna cover this later. I'm actually gonna take my brush here. Excuse my head. Dab it off so it's not sopping wet. And kind of pull that down. And then I just have to be conscious not to stick my fingers in that. I'm actually gonna put a little bit more glue on this because it's already drying. And then fold that last bit over, make sure I crimp my corners in. Okay. And there we go. That's our cover. I should take too a little bit more of this marker paper. You can see on my other cover here, I got a square of this marker paper on the inside of this that I just glued down. But I'm actually gonna put that off for now because we're already got like a half an hour left and I still have to show you guys how to sew. And that's gonna take us some time. So keep in mind, you can cover that little ugly bit up, but I'm just gonna skip right by that for now. So the sewing part is probably the trickiest part of bookbinding. So I've drawn up a diagram for you guys and we're gonna take this slowly. We're gonna start with showing you guys, I told you earlier that Coptic binding is done by attaching your books directly to your pages, like we have here. You can see my little lines of thread right there is attached directly to my pages. I'll show you guys, I'll finish this one later. So I'm gonna show you guys the first steps of that, and then I'm gonna come back to this one here and show you guys how you put on your final cover and everything. If I can find, everything's covered in paper, what I'm looking for, that's this right here. And I just remembered really quickly that I didn't show you how to use the awl and punch holes in your paper, so I'm gonna do that real fast. But once you have your paper folded, it's gonna look something like this. And when you're doing Coptic binding, it is an exposed binding, right? You're not putting any kind of edge over it, like I did right here. This one has, that one's exposed. So you kind of want it to look pretty, but you don't actually need all your stitches to be perfectly even. So I have measured out here, I've evenly split this up so I have 6 different sewing holes that I'm going to be going through. It's important when you're doing Coptic binding that you have an even number of holes. It just has to be even. They can be weirdly spaced, it's fine. They just have to be even. So you can eye them if you want to, but if you want them to look pretty and even, this was a 11-inch piece of paper and I divided it into 7 sections. So 11 divided by 7, which was like 1.57, and then just measured that out with the ruler. So I got that pre-done already. This is kind of my template that I'm using. I'm gonna open up my paper And then we're gonna find our awl here. And we have two awls here. This one is slightly thinner. I used the thicker one. It's gonna be a bit easier when you're starting out to have larger holes, even though they're gonna look a little bit worse. They're gonna be a lot easier to sew through because you're gonna have to sew through every hole twice, sometimes 3 times, but we'll get to that. But I'm just gonna line my template up with the spine of this piece of paper and then just punch my holes in really quickly. Make sure when you're doing this too, that it's actually going through the back and peeking out a little. You don't want it to just kind of get the very tip of it out there because the holes on the other side of this paper are going to be slightly smaller and that's going to be really annoying when you're sewing. So make sure you get it through the paper entirely, and then you would do that with your entire stack. And I didn't even mention signatures. This is the thing with bookbindings. There's so much information to cover, and there's so many different types that it kind of gets a little overwhelming. But I need to mention really quickly that I just punched holes through one sheet of paper here, but traditionally books are bound in signatures. And signatures are just groups of folded paper. So you can see right here, I just have one piece of folded paper inside another. Traditionally, signatures consist of 4 pieces of folded paper all within each other. This one just has 2. I did that because since we're working with thicker paper, it's gonna cause strain on the spine if our signatures are really, really thick. So I split them all up so there's only 2 per signature as opposed to 4. When you're going down to thinner paper, you might want to have 4 in each signature, but just keep that in mind. It gets harder when it's thicker. But I punched these signatures just folded up together like this as opposed to just one sheet at a time. It'll save you a bit of time. So we got that all the way. I'm going to show you guys really quickly. I just have a scrap piece here and I'm going to show you how I attach this piece of paper to our cover. I got this illustration here to kind of guide you guys along, and I will finish drawing this out and post this to our Jerry's Live Facebook group afterwards so you guys can reference it. You can always watch this video back as well because it's a lot, but we have this, we have our thread, and we have beeswax. Now, this thread is unwaxed. You can buy pre-waxed thread, but if you get unwaxed thread like this, I highly recommend, 1, you keep track of where you put your needles, and 2, you wax your thread prior to using it. I'm gonna pull this out really quick. Normally what I do, if you guys have never sewn anything before, thread can get really unwieldy when it comes past your elbow, they traditionally say. But for bookbinding, you want your thread to like last through the whole binding process. So normally what I do is I do to my elbow and then 3 times that length is what gets me there. I will show you guys how you can fix it if you get your thread a little bit too short and you don't want to restart the book. But I need some scissors to cut this.
Facebook is wondering if you could use waxed dental floss.
I mean, you could try.
I think it would stretch too much.
Yeah, it's really is very stretchy. The thing is, like, people have made books out of all kinds of things for thousands and thousands of years, and I'm sure someone has done that. I'm sure someone has. So if you want to try it, you're welcome to, but it might not make the best sketchbook around. I'm not sure how that dental floss is gonna react over time. I'm not sure if it's gonna yellow your paper over time. I'm gonna show you guys here real quickly. All I'm doing to wax this thread is I've made a little groove in my beeswax, and I'm pulling the thread through a couple of times. And the benefits to waxing your thread is that it's gonna keep your thread from tangling. It's gonna make it harder for your thread to just knot up while you're sewing since we're working with such a large piece. And it's gonna give your thread just a little bit of friction that'll help hold everything together and keep everything really tight. I have done a lot of different sketchbooks without doing this, just was using normal sewing thread. And it was a bit of a nightmare, and it made sewing them so much more difficult. So waxing your thread, just like the little things, get really important. So I am going to put a knot in the back of this. And if we can go to the dynamic really quick, I'm going to show you guys really quickly. There's lots of tutorials for this online, but how to knot your thread if you've never double knotted sewing thread before, yes.
Will the wax stain the paper and affect the watercolor painting or however you decorate or fill your sketchbook?
It will not, no. Beeswax and bees honey, I think, are naturally archival. They're naturally non-acidic, so it shouldn't damage your paper at all. Plus, it's such a small amount of wax that it's been tradition for thousands of years to wax your thread. So it's not gonna be really much of a problem, but I'm gonna show you guys really quick. I made one knot here. Let's see if I can get this. That is the wrong direction, sorry. I made one little knot here, and when I create my second knot to double knot this, I'm making sure that it stays within my loop. And I'm just gonna take that other end and pull it taut so that I have a little double knot there. It's important to double knot this since we're working with slightly larger punch holes in our paper. And we can go back to the overhead. That you double knot your thread so you don't pull the knot through your holes. I actually did that earlier when I was binding that, and I had to fix it really quick. But hopefully you don't have to deal with that because it's not very fun. Okay, so how you attach your cover to your paper. You're gonna start by opening up your signature and pulling your knot through there, straight through. Your needle's gonna come straight through that signature. And I keep, I don't tie another knot on the end to hold my needle in. I just keep a little bit of a tail right here, and it's super hard to see because it's white thread on a white background with white lines. So I'm sorry about that, but I got about a 3-inch tail just hanging off the edge of this needle so I can pull it off if I want to. But I got just a knot coming through that signature right now. And this is kind of the tricky part. And I'm sorry, but can we actually go back to the dynamic really quick? Okay, let's see if I can get this in here. Get it focused. There we go. Okay, so my thread is coming out of this hole right here. And if it's not gonna focus, we probably just wanna go back to the overhead. See if it's just focusing on something. There we go. It was focusing on the background. Okay. I've got holes punched like 1/4 of an inch into my board right there. And all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring this straight down into that board on the inside and through that hole. Make sure it pulls through all the way and that I don't stab myself with that needle. Okay. Pull that taut. And then I'm gonna come around this side and actually loop it back through my thread. And I do not have that on camera. Loop it back through that little thread that's coming down. I'm gonna pull that taut. And then I'm gonna punch it back into my signature. And pull it through. And I'm gonna show you guys how to do this one more time in case you didn't get it there, but feel free to watch this back later. And I will also have this diagram posted if you need it. There's lots of helpful diagrams out there for this, but I'm gonna come through my next hole here, if I can see it. Hello, there we go. Pull it out here. And then again, I'm gonna come down through the board. Pull it out. Okay, and that's gonna pull your paper so that it's almost like pulling it back a little bit. If I pull this taut, it's gonna do that, but just let it relax and keep it flush with the corner of your book board here. And then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna loop it through that edge of the paper there. See if I can get this focused. There we go, okay. Pulling back through there. I'm gonna come back up and then I'm gonna put it again right back into my signature. Whoop. Okay, there we go. And then you can see if I flip this around that I got these 2 threads through my hole and attached to my paper. And you're going to do the same thing on every hole throughout this book until you get to the end. And that's when things change up a little bit. So I'm going to pull out my other sheets real quick because I have zoomed for a little bit and already attached some of my signatures to this. Okay, I've already attached like 4 signatures to this. The important thing is when you come to the end of the row, when you're first attaching this book, is that you don't want to put your needle back through the signature hole. Instead, I just realized that I have to pull my thread back out of this one. I was like, where did my needle just go? Instead, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be putting your needle into the next signature that you're adding on. And keep in mind too, we punched holes into these signatures in this specific pattern. But if you accidentally flip your signature around, it's going to make things just go a little bit off. So double check before you add any more signatures on that they are lined up properly, because it's very easy to just have this facing like the wrong direction this way, and then your holes are going to be slightly off and you're going to have a little bit of a wiggly spine, which yes, I have done before that too. I learned bookbinding by trial and error. I did not watch any tutorials. It was kind of a nightmare, but we got here. Okay, I have my thread right here on the inside of this, and I actually have to add a needle to it. And remember, not to just leave my other needles lying around. So I'm gonna pull that one out and place my other needle back onto this. And you'll notice here, I have very little thread, and I have 2 more signatures in my other cover that I still need to add on. I kept this short purposefully so I can show you guys what you'll need to do if like you cut your thread just a little bit too short. So I'm gonna lace that needle onto there real quickly, and I'm gonna pull it through my last hole in my signature. Well, okay, here. I'm gonna show you guys really quickly what to do if you end up in this situation, because I can tell right now, like this thread is still pretty long, but I can tell right now that I'm not gonna have enough, because this won't even last to like the end. If I like loop that way and then come back, it won't even last to the end of this sheet of paper. So if you end up in a situation like this where you don't have enough thread, ideally you would undo your whole bookbinding and redo it all if you want a book that's super strong and sturdy. If you don't want to do that, if you're like me and you want a little shortcut, all you've got to do is take your thread, make sure your needle is on it. I don't know why I pulled it off. Give me just a second. Oh my gosh. This is the part where it's like, you either thread the needle perfectly on the first try, or it takes you 10 minutes. And that's how I know that my eyes are getting old. But I'm gonna make sure my needle's thread, and I have this little line of thread right here. Let me see if I can hold that up. Yeah, I have this little line of thread right here where my thread had been pulled through. I'm gonna pull it through there. Okay, I'm gonna make my tail a little bit shorter so that it comes through as well. Okay, I got it looped through there, and then I'm gonna put it directly through this loop. So I'm just creating a knot into that thread that was already there. I'm gonna make sure that knot is super tight and lines up with my punch hole right there. I'm sorry that this is so hard to see, guys. Lots of times people will use colored thread for this type of binding, and you can probably tell why. Okay, so I put a knot right there. I'm actually gonna put a second knot just to be extra safe. I'm gonna pull in the opposite direction so that I know it's super tight. And I'm gonna leave this tail. I'm gonna pull my needle off and I'm gonna leave this tail. I'm not gonna cut it short yet. Because what I'm gonna do is when I get a little bit more thread, and I'm actually gonna take the thread that I was using previously so I don't wax a whole nother bit for you guys. So let me just cut that off real fast. I have this piece of thread here. I'm gonna make sure I put another knot back in it. So double knot it again. Bookbinding is very monotonous, which is why you need a lot of patience to do it. I'm not always very patient, which is why I do cheats like this when I mess up and cut the thread too short. But it's good because one of the benefits of binding your own books is that if you guys ever have new sketchbook syndrome, where it's like the book's so perfect you don't want to ruin it, or you feel like you're ruining it, no one's going to ruin it by trying to put art in a book. Well, maybe if it's not your book, but in any case, I think making your own sketchbook, you find you get like little mistakes and errors and things like that, that like, even if you're a perfect bookbinder, like you look at that and you've already done so much work to create it, you've essentially already made a perfect piece of art, that you get a little bit less worried about messing it up when you put more artwork into it, essentially, right? It's kind of like you've already been working on an art piece for so many hours that it's hard to be nervous about doing more, right? So I pulled that thread through this hole, and I'm actually gonna pull it back out just a little bit. gonna try to, actually, can we go to the dynamic again? I'm gonna push all of this away so it's not focusing on all that. Okay. I've got these two threads right here pulled out, and all I'm gonna do is knot them together. And I'm gonna set it down to do that because unfortunately I'm not that good at holding things while knotting at the same time. So I'm going to knot that together. Be careful when you're knotting because this thread attached to my needle is loose, so you can pull it back through that hole a little bit too much. And I'm sorry this isn't in focus right now, guys, but I promise I'm just putting a knot in things, so it's not too exciting. Okay, but I've knotted those two together, and that is when I can now cut these if I want to. Leave a little bit of room there so that if you come back, you can either glue these again with your loose ends with the PVA glue, or sometimes I see people burn them. I always glue them because I don't trust myself not to set the whole book on fire, but I'm gonna pull that whole thing taut, and then that's how, if you're running out of thread, you can connect a little extra bit, but you just have to have a little bit of forethought about it. So we can go back to the overhead again. And I accidentally put a little bit of knot in my thread, so I gotta pull it out. There we go. Okay, so I'm back on this side. I've got my thread here pulled through this hole. What I'm gonna do is, I might have to go back to the dynamic again. I am so sorry, guys. I'm just making you run back and forth. I'm like, it'll be easier if I'm up top. It's not. It's not easier. Okay, there we go. I've just pulled my thread through this hole right here, and I'm actually gonna come down, and you can see I have a little bit of thread kind of bridging the gap between these two signatures. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my needle and thread it through that. Now, lots of times when people are bookbinding, they will use a curved needle. You can see why right now that would be important. If you're using a straight needle, because the reason I chose a straight needle for this is that oftentimes they're more common. You're more likely to have one laying around, so you're more likely to use one. It's really important when you're planning out where to put these holes in your signatures that you make sure whatever needle you're using isn't gonna get blocked by them. So you can see the length of my needle here is, like, the length between the edge of this book and this signature is greater than the length of my needle. So if they were shorter and I was trying to pull that needle through that one line right there, it's gonna be really frustrating. And that's one of the things that has made my bookbinding in the past very frustrating, and I had to restart and just punch whole new signatures with new holes because I just couldn't get the straight needle through. If you have a curved needle, that's not something you have to worry as much about. If you have a straight one, it really is. And all I'm gonna do once I looped it through the bottom of that is that I'm gonna bring it back into my signature. Make sure it doesn't get caught on the edge of my paper here. And then I'm gonna push it. Oh, wait. I was at the end. I messed up. I apologize. I just told you guys that if you're at the end of a signature, not to pull it back through the signature, and that is what I just did. So I'm gonna pull it back out. So I've just looped it through the end of that. It is loose, and now we're going to add another signature to this. So that is not the one I want. Is this it? Yes, it is. I'm gonna come right here, and I'm gonna make sure that all my holes align properly with my other ones, and they do. So I'm gonna open this up a little bit and slide it right here. Just try to hold it as tight as possible. And then I'm gonna take my needle and pull it through this signature rather than through the other one like I just did. Sorry about that, guys. We're gonna pull that, make sure it's really, really tight. The thing about working with thicker paper is that you're more likely to get gaps between signatures when you're sewing, so make sure you're pulling this as tight as possible. Yes.
Kathy on YouTube would like to know, would soft covers be possible for travel books, or is the sturdiness of the board needed for stability?
Soft covers are possible for travel books, yeah, of course. For this type of binding, I do not really recommend them, because when you're punching these holes through your cover, whoops, and when you're pulling this thread through, you gotta make sure this thread is super taut. So I've tried soft covers with this type of binding before, and I pulled this thread taut and it just ripped the whole cover through like that, which is why hard covers are really preferred for this type of binding. But other types of binding, like Japanese stab binding, which I'm so sorry. I'm making you guys go back up, aren't I? No, wait. Just keep it here. I can show you guys
here. I
here.
wasn't ready for that, like,
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, Japanese stab binding. You see, you stab the paper together. This is a soft cover, and soft covers are ideal for this type of binding. You also don't have to fold signatures for this type of binding. You can just have loose sheets that you essentially stab together. I think it might also be called Chinese stab binding. But yeah, you just stab the binding. So maybe if you need a little cathartic day, that might be a great thing to do. Okay, all I've done right here is when I pulled this thread into the signature, I came back on the inside and then pulled it out of this hole right here. And then I'm gonna do the same thing again where I loop down through the bottom and punch it back up. And then loop back through the top of this. And again, I gotta make sure, you can see this is getting a little bit loose already, or maybe you can't because it's white thread. If I had forethought, I might have dyed this thread for you guys, so apologies for that. But I'm gonna make sure that this, I come back in and I pull this all.
And are you using any specific type of thread?
Not really, it's the same as sewing thread essentially. Some people will use a bit of a thicker type of thread, and oftentimes when you buy pre-waxed thread, it will be a bit thicker. As you guys saw in the example that I first showed you, when I brought up Coptic binding, that the thread in that book was a lot thicker than the one I'm using right now. But you can take sewing thread and wax it and use it for bookbinding just fine. And lots of professional bookbinders will use really thin threads when they're binding, so that they're really like not noticeable.
That was my next question, was about pre-wax thread, so thank you.
Yeah, yes.
You mentioned earlier that you might have dyed the thread. What would you use to dye it with?
Just any kind of traditional fabric dye would work. Make sure you dye it before you wax it. Yeah, anything like that would work. I have never actually dyed thread myself. Lots of times when people are designing books, see, you can see here what I just did. I pushed it through my hole here, but if I come around on the other side, it's not coming through my signature because it only came through on this other page beneath here. So keep that in mind. If you push it through and you're suddenly like, where did my needle go? It might just be that it didn't go straight through the center. Yes.
What would you recommend to prevent your pages from sticking together?
Pages, why are your pages sticking together is a good question, because if you're sewing like this, I'm not sure why that would be happening. What type of paper are you using? What do you mean by sticking? Because you could just mean like your paper's clumping together, I guess, as opposed to like sticking. I always make sure that my hand is right here pulling these apart while I'm sewing it through the signature. So if I can get some clarity on that question, I might be able to help a little bit more. What did I just do? Oh, I think I might have just torn something. Or maybe not. Let's see really quick. I'm gonna try to loop it. See, I looped it through that hole and then it pulled right out. And it could be because I just tore the paper a little bit. Or I just didn't get through the hole properly. Okay, yeah, we're good. Not sure why that happened, but it did. Okay, I'm coming around on the inside. And I'm gonna finish this one signature up, and then I'm gonna show you guys really quickly how to put on your cover, or at least the first few steps to start putting on your cover. Like I said at the very beginning, this is a ton of information for an hour-long show. If you guys, I'm sure you guys will have more questions about bookbinding, and this is a lot of content all at once. You can see this is also the downside of using a straight needle right here, is that you kind of have to push it in to get a little bit of leverage to then grab the needle. And I'm having a little bit of trouble doing that right now. I'm going to use both my hands really quick. There we go. I got it through there. Like I said, curved needles tend to be a little bit easier. Straight needles are more common though, which is why I'm showing you how to do this. Yes?
Would you use any sort of clamp ever to keep the paper tight while you sew it together?
Yeah. I mean, that can be super helpful. One of the reasons that I don't do it personally is that if I'm adding signatures on, I'm taking this a little bit slowly right now so you guys can see a bit better what I'm doing. But if I'm sewing through this really fast and adding new signatures on, I would constantly have to be adjusting the clip, which is part of the reason why I don't do it. But when you are making sure your paper is cut properly, like if I were to cut down this paper, something that I would do is I would put all of my paper in a block, clamp it together with the binder clips that I put in the teacher's cart, and then I would cut it all at once in one block using my X-Acto blade, which is a tricky thing to do that I did want to show you guys tonight, but since we are kind of short for time already, I decided it was one of the lesser important things. I can walk you guys through it if you really want to know though, if you talk about it in the chat at all, but essentially you're just stacking your paper up into a block and then cutting very slowly through it like I did with the cardboard. And make sure this is flush with my paper here so I can get it through. So that you can get through the whole block of paper, and you would clamp it together in order to do that. The other reason I have those binder clamps in the teacher's cart is that if you wanted to glue the spine with the PVA glue afterwards, you can, and that can help reduce some of the gaping between signatures in your book. Because you're going to see as soon as I open this that there's a bit of a gap just because of how thick the paper is. And you would need clamps to be able to do that, to be able to glue this thing down, because essentially all you're doing is clamping your paper, trying to get it as tight as possible, and then applying that glue in a few different layers until it dries. So let me pull through this last one, and then I'm going to show you guys how to attach the cover. And for the sake of time, I was going to punch the cover that we just made, but we're running really short on time. So I'm actually just going to, okay, you get to the end of your signature there, and I'm not going to pull this back through that signature. I've looped it through the bottom, and I'm just going to leave it like that for a second. I was going to use this cover that we just made and punch holes in it. All you have to do is line it up with your template like you did for the paper, and use your awl. If you have a really thick board, you can also use a nail and a hammer to do it, to punch your holes in. But I pre-punched this, and this is the one I was showing you how to sew in earlier. Sorry about that, guys. I want to keep it on the dynamic so you guys can see what I'm doing, but I'm moving around a lot right now. I pre-punched this earlier, so I'm actually going to attach this to show you guys how to do it, and I'm probably going to go back later and redo the binding with the nicer cover for myself, so we don't have to have this bare binding on it. But I'm going to show you guys how you can attach this, which is very similar to how we did it at the very beginning, where I'm going to come up and I'm going to loop it into the top of this. I'm going to push this back a little bit so you guys can see it better. Into the top of this. And then I'm going to pull it around like that so it kind of loops. And then I'm going to put it back into my signature. So I got to open up my signature again and then pull it back through this hole right here if I can get it. This is where you need a lot of hands to be able to do this. Okay, let me see right here. Make sure that's taut. Come on. Tiny little needles. There we go. I just got it in. Okay, pulling it back through my signature and then pulling that taut. So now you can see our cover is attached. If you guys have any more questions, let me know real quick. I'm going to show you guys how to do it one more time. So, pulling it through my signature there. So I was about to come through the bottom, but I'm going to come through the top. That makes a lot more sense. Coming down through the top of this. Okay, and then looping it back into my signature right here. And I need to reopen my signature real quick so I can get it in. Again, if you guys are confused about anything, because I know I'm covering a lot right now, please leave it in the comments, because I will go back and I will clarify things if you guys need that. Okay, but I got that pulled through. You can see I got both these holes pulled taut. And all I would do if I was going to end this cover right now, oh wait, oh my gosh. I don't know if you guys can see what I just did, but I have my signature like this, where I have the center page. Essentially, I just punched a new hole in my paper that I didn't mean to do. So I'm gonna pull that through real quick. That's the problem. If you're going fast in bookbinding, you can punch new holes in your paper that you did not want to have. Okay, so if this was the end of this and I was to end this right now, all I would do is I would do the same thing I would do if I was increasing my thread, where I would loop it through right there and create a bit of a knot and pull it this way so it keeps taut. And then do it again just for safety measures. And then cut that short, and I can put a little bit of glue right there, or I can burn it a little bit, and we can get that perfect and good to go. So that's our book. It's not a perfectly done book, but I think we got a lot done for a short amount of time, and I can open it up for you guys to see really quickly what it looks like so we can see the inside. And I'll show you guys, this is the gap that I was talking about when you sew these pages together. That is the gap where if you want to go back through and you want to add this PVA glue onto the spine of this, clamp it shut, use your glue brush, and just brush it onto the edge of here, and it should dry. And I can show you guys really quick. I made a little example here in case we couldn't get to it. This is what it looks like when it's glued taut. You can see it's a really flexible glue, so it can still bend open and lay flat, which is what the important thing about Coptic binding if you want to create a sketchbook. That's the downside to this Japanese stab binding I showed you guys earlier. You cannot lay this book flat, unfortunately. I'm not going to open it up because I have old sketches in there, but you cannot lay this book flat. You're going to have to take my word for it. Okay, so we are good to go on that. Wrapping this up really quick. If you guys saw any of the materials tonight and you want to get them for yourself, you want to try out bookbinding, check out our teacher's cart. Just type JL297 into the search address on JerrysArtarama.com and it'll pop up. Again, please, if you have any questions about bookbinding, I've been doing it for a very long time. This is a lot of info to condense into one show. So please let me know in the comments. I will come back and answer them tomorrow morning. Thank you guys so much for coming. Next week, we're going to have a vendor show, so it's going to be on Facebook only. I'm sorry, YouTube people, we're not going to be here, but that's going to be new sew flat colors with Kevin Greeland from Golden. So that's going to be some fun stuff that we're going to be talking about. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. If you want to try bookbinding, if you have any questions, if you want to check out this diagram that I'm going to be finishing for you guys and posting on there, go to our Jerry's Live Facebook group. Answer the security question, otherwise we will deem you a robot and you will not be accepted into the group. But please check us out there, and thank you guys so much for coming. Bye!